The Russian and US presidents have celebrated their meeting in Alaska that mainly focused on the Ukraine war as constructive and productive. Russia's Vladimir Putin said Moscow considers this a step towards dialogue. He said Moscow is interested in putting an end to the war in Ukraine, but he said any agreement must take into account Russia's security concerns. Donald Trump also hailed the talks as extremely productive. He said some great progress was made on Ukraine and there's a good chance of reaching a result. But he said one significant issue remains unresolved and there would be no deal unless every single issue is settled. Trump added that he will also shortly consult with NATO leaders and the Ukrainian president, who was not invited to the Alaska summit. Putin's trip to Alaska was the first by a Russian president to the US since 2015. Russia has been fighting the war in Ukraine since February 2022. The war was triggered over what Moscow calls NATO's presence at its doorstep. Now, to talk more on this, we are joined by our very own Mr. Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist, joining us all the way from Bristol, UK. Mr. Gosling, good to see you again. Mr. Gosling, your thoughts on the meeting and why Alaska was chosen as the venue, and why wasn't the very president that is the leader of one side of the war not invited?
Well, it's because Zelensky is not really in charge in any way. So why would he be at the talks? He's a creature just as Zaluzhny, who's being trained to speak English to replace him by MI6, MI6 is running these presidents. They're their little puppets, and so they would interfere with the talks. Anyway, the main players, of course, are the NATO countries and Russia. So, what you asked, why Alaska? Well, I've heard very few people saying why Alaska is very important. And the reason, of course, is that Alaska is where Russia is close to the United States, but most importantly, it's the part of the United States which is the furthest away possible from Europe. And Europe is what's causing the problems. If you read your history books, you'll find that both World War I and World War II were started by Europeans, and it seems as if they're trying now to start World War III. And so the best thing to do, of course, is if you're going to have a meeting, is to get well away from Europe if you're going to have that meeting.
That's right, Mr. Gosling. Mr. Gosling, President Putin emphasized on Russia's security concerns. In your opinion, what does it mean by that?
Okay, so there are two concerns or two criteria for this ceasefire, which actually could very easily happen. The Europeans don't want it to happen. The Americans do, because they want to normalize relations with the Russians, as we should. But our European powers don't seem to want to do that. The first is what you're talking about, is this what Keir Starmer calls a reassurance force. Well, I think he's only talking really about reassuring himself that the war can continue with Russia. But a reassurance force is what they call a security guarantee. So when there's a ceasefire, they say, well, we still don't really trust you Russians. We're going to have a bunch of NATO troops in Ukraine. Well, of course, this is a disaster, a red line, and it's likely to not just reignite the Ukraine war, but actually a hot war between NATO and Russia. So this is just a stupid idea. It's a maniac or World War III idea that's got into the British Prime Minister's head, who anyway really is, I mean, I talked about poor old Zelensky being a creature of MI6. Well, Keir Starmer is a creature of the Trilateral Commission, one of these little David Rockefeller think tanks, a private think tank. And he's a puppet, you know, he does what he's told. He's an obedient little boy on the stage of the world. And so that's the one. The security guarantees are just a way of trying to stop there being any kind of peace agreement, because they're totally impossible and unnecessary. The second part of the ceasefire deal the Russians want, and the Americans almost certainly quietly want, and they try and keep this fairly quiet because they don't want to upset their European friends. the territorial swap. So what they're now looking at is areas of territory that the Russians have, which have taken from Ukraine, which are not in the four main oblasts, which the Russians want in the Donbass. These Russian-speaking areas where the Ukrainian Nazis and Kiev soldiers were randomly killing Russian-speaking people after the coup, the autonomous Donbass zone. So that's a very reasonable request. The extra areas that the Russians want in those four oblasts, the Russian-speaking oblasts, could be quite possibly swapped for areas of land that the Russians have taken within Ukraine. And that is a fairly simple deal to do, but of course the Europeans don't want to do that deal. They say ridiculous, silly things, really, for the stupid people, like, the Constitution doesn't allow it. The Ukrainian Constitution doesn't allow President Zelensky to still be the president, and so they're obviously just playing fast and loose with their own constitution in Ukraine.
Mr. Gosling, I also wanted to ask Dan, you kind of answered me answered the question, because there was four provinces in the east of the country that Russia wanted to annex. It was Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, which was since 2022, and then also you have Crimea, which happened in 2014. Do you think that's going to happen? Do you think would Europe allow it to happen?
Yes, of course it's going to happen. Unless there is NATO launches a hot war against Russia to try and stop them, it might not in that case. But the Russians are smashing the front. I'm sure you've seen the news this week that the Russians have actually punctured right through the Ukrainian front. The Ukrainian army is so weak, they're now having to try to force 60-year-olds at gunpoint to join the army. There was even a video of an elderly man holding 2 grenades in his hand, saying, "Look, I'm homeless. I've got no family. If you try and press gang me into the Ukrainian army, I'm going to kill myself and kill you." So this is the sort of thing that's going on in Ukraine right now. The army's collapsed and collapsing. And so the Russians are trying, I think, to lose the fewest number of Russian soldiers, push fairly gently through, and they've managed to do that. And they're right round behind the lines right now, cutting off supply lines to the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainian front, I'm afraid, is collapsing as we speak, which might be why the discussions, by the way, in Alaska will have been going on behind the scenes. They won't be being made public. But do you know what? I actually think that there is a lot in common between the United States, who want to trade with Russia, and the Russians. And it might even be that the United States goes behind the Europeans' back and forms an alliance with the Russians against these European maniacs trying to start World War III.
So, Mr. Gosling, before wrapping this up, is it fair to say that Trump is kind of telling the EU that the US is running the show now?
No. Well, what I think he's saying, because obviously the EU, von der Leyen, the non-elected president of Europe, she is very much for this war with Ukraine, with Russia, a proxy war using Ukraine. But no, the United States, I think, is signaling very strongly that we're actually floating off across the Atlantic. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is crumbling, and we're going to leave you. If you want to have a world war in Europe, then you're on your own, guys. And of course, nobody, ordinary people in Europe, don't want to have that. And the Europeans can breathe a bit of a sigh of relief, because there's been no big announcements from Trump or Putin tonight. But I can assure you, behind the scenes, there's been lots of discussions about what to do to box in not the Russians, but the maniacal Europeans, and particularly the British MI6.
That's right, Tony. Sorry, I think you misunderstood my question, because what I meant by running the show was not running the war, but also, but meaning making the decisions in order to have an agreement, to stop the war, to have a truce, and things like that.
Well, I don't think the Americans are in a position to do that, because the Ukrainians are very much closer geographically to Europeans, and the Europeans want to still keep supporting this war. So, of course, he's doing a bit of an end run around the Europeans, and he is, I suppose, gently threatening Europe that if they carry on with this war, that this is going to ruin relations with the United States.
There you have it, Mr. Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist, joining us all the way from Bristol, UK.
Okay.
Mr. Gosling,
Thank
as
you.
always, thank you for your time, sir.